Welcome to the Petro Papers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yoga Shripadan, and with me here today, I have Yalda Barzin from Repsol. Today, we're going to talk about URTEC 3722999. Paper title and the description is in the description box below for our viewers and listeners. I'm going to read a little bit about Yalda before I start peppering her with questions. She's the Reservoir Engineering Advisor for Repsol. She is the Subsurface Advisor to Unconventional Center of Excellence with a focus on ongoing development and optimization projects in the Eagle Ford and Duvernay operated assets. She was also the co-founder of SUSA Energy in Calgary, Canada, and worked as a petroleum engineering consultant at the Barzin Consulting Group. She also worked for IHS Markit as an associate director of product management. She also was a research engineer for University of Calgary. She got her PhD in petroleum engineering from the University of Calgary, a Master of Science from the IFP School, and the Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Amir Kabir University of Technology, Tehran Polytechnic. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to go ahead and start with our viewers and listeners about what the paper is about. So could you briefly describe what your paper is about and the motivation behind the paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So this paper is really about choke management of liquid-rich wells in shale reservoirs. It's looking at the CGR trend or condensate gas ratio trend and its relationship to change in choke, or in other words, with drawdown. And I was trying to share my learnings and observations that I've had in the last 10 years working and analyzing gas condensate wells, and the recent activities that I had regarding optimization of drawdown for gas condensate wells. And I hope that this paper is a good summary of all these learnings that I've had, again, regarding the CGR trend change versus choke management.
Awesome. I know that when I read the paper, I was extremely excited to talk to you because I did a whole master's thesis on drawdown management. And I know we had a conversation about this before starting this podcast. So I was really excited to see how you've approached choke management in the specific reservoirs that you've worked in. I wanted to pivot to, well, the ending of the paper. And you had you had a conclusion, you had a specific conclusion about your paper about slower drawdown achieving 50% or more condensate in the first 3 years of production. I wanted to know, how did that correlate to EUR?
Let me just in brackets explain that that's one example, and I would not like to generalize that 50% more production that I have in the paper into every gas condensate, because specifically it depends, as the title of the paper says, to the drawdown management. So the specific completion of that slow drawdown well, the specific completion design of it, and specific choke history of it just led for that particular well compared to the well next to it with a more aggressive drawdown to have 50% more. So I'm not advertising 50% more, but yes, more production of condensate. I do not have a number or a value for you for exactly how much EUR percentage more, because what I wanted to publish was the short-term production of condensate. Why? Because when we're doing our choke management, at the end of the day, we want to optimize the economics. And basically what matters to economics most is the short-term cash flow. So everybody's looking at the 1 to 5 years of production. So the observation for those two wells, one of them with slow drawdown and the other with the more aggressive drawdown, was that the slow drawdown had lower gas recovery for the first 3 years. then it caught up to the gas production of the fast drawdown. However, the condensate caught up to the fast drawdown in 6 months and started just ramping up and producing more and more. And I just picked 3 years as a random, time frame to just show that only by the first 3 years you have 50% more condensate recovery. Obviously, the EUR will be more than 50%, but I do not have that exact value that you're asking me for.
Sure. I think where I was getting at is if you see a linear correlation with the condensate production and the impact to the EUR. So I was just curious about that, but it's good to know that you get more, that's a specific example of getting more condensate production.
The impact is not linear, or I guess, let me see if I understood this question. If you look at the CGR profiles of all these gas condensate wells, the shape of the CGR profile is not what we expect from classical PBT. Everybody knows that. For majority of them, 80%, 90% of these wells, the CGR starts at the CGRI and keeps declining until it hits a minimum CGR, which also is corresponding to your minimum bottom hole pressure, or the stabilized bottom hole pressure that you maintain your well at. And then from that point on, and depending on your drawdown strategy, that could be after 6 months or 2 years or 3 years, or as long as you would keep your bottom hole pressure above that minimum. But from there on, your CGR is constant, or for all practical purposes, I would call it constant, but it's declining with a very, very small slope. So really what matters is how fast you draw down your well to get to that minimum bottom hole pressure. And that's where you get from CGRI to the minimum. From there on, you're not having a major impact on your condensate recovery, or basically what you're winning in optimizing your condensate is within the time that you draw down from PI to minimum bottom hole pressure. From there on, it's not added, it's not exponential. So basically, it's not linear. It is linear during the first, the period that you're declining. Once you hit minimum bottom hole pressure, it subsides. The impact on you.
No, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, sure.
I am a huge fan of data. So I'm a huge fan of high resolution data myself as a reservoir engineer. And I wanted you to talk about if you can discuss the importance of the resolution of these data in order for you to do your analysis.
Absolutely. For this study that I've done, and it took me years of observation, I've only picked, and I've seen all kinds of condensate data, public, in-house, clients data, internal data, volume, separator conditions, corrected, non-corrected, wells that have had their own wellhead separator versus wells that the whole pad is going to a bulk and test separator. And I realized that the most important a factor for me going into this study is only look at the data that was reliable and that was at high resolution. And it was for the wells that did have their own wellhead separator, and they were not going into a bulk and test separator setup, and that every well was having a separator volume correction according to its temperature and pressure that came out of an equation of state modeling workflow. It is very important because condensate data is often very noisy, and everybody who's ever worked with gas condensate wells will admit that they're the most noisy data that we can get out there is the condensate. So if you're trying to find trends, and if you're trying to say that here's the trend that I have observed, and it is the trend, you have to make sure that the data, all these wells, over 100 wells that I've studied, are reliable. So basically, and the granularity of the data, I started with observing the trends on the daily data. But then when the observations were out and I was trying to summarize, I ran the observations or the summary through some of the people that I very much respect in the industry, Louis Metar, Dr. Pulai Darvish, and who are my mentors and very good friends. And everybody asked me, do you want to look at it at an hourly or like bi-hourly, whatever, like high resolution during flowback, and make sure that the same thing is is applicable during that time. So I even went and looked at very highly granular data during flowback, and I saw the same trend. And that was when I was like, okay, I believe that this trend is reliable. I can report it as a learning.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that confirmation. I wanted to pivot to something a little bit more specific. It was over the isotherms. I'm usually used to hearing the Langmuir isotherm when it comes to gas, but I was wondering why you chose the BET isotherm over the Langmuir. It was explained in the paper, but I want viewers and listeners to also know why one was chosen over the other.
Sure, obviously. So BET isotherms are an extension of the Langmuir classical type A isotherms that we like simply just refer to them as Langmuir isotherm. They're the extension of them into infinity at high pressures. So when the type A Langmuir was developed many years ago in the early 1900s, it was for lower pressure reservoirs. It was looking at one layer of adsorption basically on one molecule of gas, one type of molecule. But when we're dealing with very high pressure reservoirs like Duvernay or Eagle Ford or Vaca Muerta, it's likely that at high pressures we have multi-molecular, multi-layer adsorptions, and that's why the classical type A is not as applicable as its modified version that is called BET. My co-author, Dr. Greg Walker, has a distinguished SP distinguished lecturer paper on that topic. I cannot recall the exact number off the top of my head, but I would encourage for whomever is interested in knowing more about BET versus the type A classical isotherms to look into Dr. Greg Walker's paper from 2017.
Awesome. Well, I'll be sure to look up that paper, and if I find it, I'll put it in the description as a site.
Sure, I can send you the reference that it is in the paper, referred in the paper as well.
Oh, it's already referred in the paper. Perfect.
Yeah,
I don't have to do the digging. Perfect. I am also interested. I'm going to pin it again. I'm also interested in just thinking about these complex reservoirs in unconventionals. And I was just curious to know, how does reservoir heterogeneity play with CGR trends?
Sorry, I had a hard time hearing that last.
Oh no, how does reservoir heterogeneity play with CGR trends?
Heterogeneity definitely and intuitively plays an impact on the trend of CGR. But what was important for me to observe was the scale of that impact compared to something like the choke change itself. Let's talk about the example of vertical heterogeneity. Let's just talk about, for simplicity, let's just take Eagle Ford as an example. So if you have wells in the lower Eagle Ford and you have hydraulic fractures that do expand and grow into upper Eagle Ford from lower Eagle Ford. At the beginning, you would produce gas from the upper Eagle Ford that is a richer or high CGR formation because it's just shallower. And then with time, as your fractures heal, you would have less and less of that high CGR, and then you would just start producing more from the lower Eagle Ford. And that's a hypothesis that is known as a reason for anomaly of CGR above dew points. So definitely it has an impact. But what I looked at in this paper is that I grabbed an example of a pad with multiple wells that are within the lower Eagle Ford, and multiple benches in the lower Eagle Ford, and then there's wells in the upper Eagle Ford. And you would expect that the CGR change of trend of CGR with production from upper layers going to and healing going into the lower layers would manifest itself. However, it may exist, but it could not show itself because choke was dominating. So the wells with a constant choke showed a constant stabilized CGR. The wells with a decreasing increasing choke size aggressively showed a decrease in CGR, and you could not decouple that from the heterogeneity because choke is dominating. So does it exist? Theory and intuition says it should, but definitely it's in a much minor scale compared to the impact of the drawdown itself.
Well, that's a really good clarification, because I know there's been complex modeling, coupling reservoir with geomechanics simulation, and taking into account how heterogeneity could impact the drawdown strategies. If choke has a huge overprint, then the heterogeneity, I wouldn't say that it doesn't matter, but choke just has an overprint.
Exactly.
Awesome. I also wanted to pivot to the RTA analysis in the paper. Well, I like RTA a lot, and
I know.
some of the limitations of RTA, as you probably know, is the assumption of single phase. So I was curious to know, could you still perform the RTA analysis, or did you take into account multi-phase effects in the RTA analysis? Because it is a gas condensate and RTA does assume single phase.
No, thanks for bringing up the topic of RTA, because just like yourself, I'm a big fan. and I get passionate when I get to talk about RTA, because it's been what I've been doing since the beginning of my career for many, many years now. That's a very, very good question. I absolutely did RTA analysis. Any well that I've learned from that went into this study, whether it's a well that I looked at 10 years ago or it's a well that I'm analyzing today for Repsol, doesn't matter. All of them have had RTA, and majority of them had numerical modeling involved. The biggest reason why I wanted to do RTA is that, and it's maybe a good time for me to bring this up, that in 2012, Dr. Whitson had a paper called PVT in liquid-rich shale reservoirs, which is a beautiful fundamental work on PVT of gas condensate wells. And I was fascinated by this conclusion from the modeling work that during infinite acting flow, your CGR tracks bottom hole pressure. And I was like, awesome. And what we all saw in 2012 and 2013 in Eagle Ford was always a long period of infinite acting flow, because you were having like very sparse fractures put along the horizontal well. So that long space would just give you a very long period of infinite acting flow. And it was very relevant at the time. As we just started with like denser completions and tighter spacing and whatnot, we're moving from a long period of infinite acting to seeing an apparent boundary dominated flow. So I had that notion and learning from that paper, and it stuck with me. And all these years, the entire last decade, I was curious to see, is CGR still tracking bottom hole pressure? And if it does, is it still during infinite acting flow, or it has passed it? And a very interesting observation was that regardless of the flow regime, independently, your CGR will always follow bottom hole pressure when you're below dew point. And I have put that observation, and I've discussed it in the paper. But so yes, I needed to identify my flow regime to be able to say that. So how did I do the flow regime identification? You have a very good point. How do we have multi-phase RTA methodology yet? Yes. How many years has it been? How reliable are they? And how confident are we in those? So yes, maybe 10 years ago or 8-9 years ago, there were no multi-phase RTA, but then after that, multiple researchers started to work on it, but specifically in the software that I was using, Louis Matar and Hamid Tabatabai have a methodology that does multi-phase analysis and looks at your specialized plot, what we call square root of time plot, or specialized or linear. Everybody who does RTA is familiar with that plot. Basically, they bring rel perms into both axes into the parameter, and they account for multi-phase. So have I looked at that? Yes, for every rel. how uncertain you are in that methodology because we don't know our relative permeabilities. Well, that's one important thing. However, I'm happy you brought this up because I will take this opportunity to maybe share one little trick with whoever is listening and is an RTA enthusiast. This is something I've learned maybe 7-8 years ago. Back in the day, Louis Matar and I were looking at how accurate the time to end of linear flow from Wattenberger's equation is. And we did a bunch of research and we realized that obviously if you're looking at the derivative versus just the normalized parameter itself, the derivative is showing end of linear flow earlier than just the curve. And we were like, okay, then how do we identify end of linear flow if there's such a gap between just the normalized rate or normalized pressure versus its derivative? Then there were no tools at the time. There were no multi-phase RTA. And this is what I would like to share, maybe a little takeaway, RTA takeaway, is that I started watching the heat maps of my numerical model. So if you have a simple numerical model that's available now in multiple commercial softwares that I'm aware of, every one of them has a simple 2D numerical model. So you run your model based on the parameters you know, and then you watch in your heat map, like on a very slow rate, you watch how your pressure propagation, maybe just like focus around one fracture and look at your pressure propagation. And as soon as the no flow boundary between your two fractures is just dropping below the PI, that's basically your end of linear flow, end of infinite acting. Now you're starting to like entering a tank depletion. So that was to me what I used in confirmation of what is my flow regime for majority of these wells, to be able to say, yes, I would like to build on Dr. Whitson's modeling work and say that the observation has been that for all these wells, regardless of what flow regime they are, the CGR always tracks bottom hole pressure.
Thank you for putting that into full circle. And I'm so glad that you brought up Whitson's paper, because we interviewed Curtis Whitson and Matthias Carlson on the podcast over another paper, but I referenced that 2012 paper with them, and I can definitely put that paper link into the description box. If
absolutely, that paper was, and I've told Dr. Whitson as well, that paper was really the fundamental work that my paper builds on, and the motivation of how I started this journey of looking at all these CGR trends, because that was the spark that, hey, at least during infinite acting, it should track bottom hole pressure. And I started from there and got to where I got.
Awesome. Well, there's one more question I need to ask you before I let you go. And I tend to ask this to a lot of the people that I've invited on the podcast. What are some implications of this paper that we haven't seen before in this industry?
Very simply put, to begin with, the relationship between choke and CGR has not been looked at in the past. How can we use that relationship now that we know there's a direct and key impact of choke strategy on the CGR is for choke optimization. There's multiple good studies out there for choke optimization that just look at simply the damage we leave behind in the reservoir based on aggressive chokes. But nobody has looked at the effect of production of condensate at the surface as a very important factor of economics. So I guess this paper helps introducing that concept. And for anybody who's trying to maximize their liquids to optimize choke, then I guess this is a beginning to start to look at the trend of CGR. And then with forward modeling of the pressure drawdown, then you can have multiple forecasts and you can run your economic model and optimize your choke. And that is what I've been doing myself for the wells that I've been working lately on. Conversely, and this is another thing that I worked on. Conversely, if you do have a choke strategy in mind, maybe your reservoir engineer and your production engineers have a strategy in mind, and I'm not advertising that's the best because we should work together, reservoir engineers and production engineers. But let's say if you have the strategy, now based on that strategy, you already have a CGR trend. So you can use that CGR trend to forecast your condensate, because forecasting condensate is one of the most difficult things to do, because condensate data is either non-existent in the public, or if they are, they're monthly. Most of them you're not aware of how they have been corrected against their separator conditions. So most often we do not have reliable condensate data to draw a type curve for it. So instead of a condensate type curve, you can use a CGR type curve that you built based on your design pressure drawdown. And then you can use that CGR type curve and apply it to your gas type curve, which is a lot more reliable data than condensate. Then you can have the condensate forecast. And again, we've used this methodology that I was examining, and for the pads that use this as forecast, you're seeing very accurate condensate recovery. So I guess these two would be two contributions that I can see these observations that I've shared can have to managing of the gas condensate wells. Maybe a third thing is something for future, but and I've written a paper that will be published in a month at ATC. It's the second part of this paper that looks at the reversibility of this relationship between choke and CGR, and we're showing that it's reversible. So if you can have a mechanism that's reversible without having a damage in the reservoir, so you can design a multi-rate test to calibrate your adsorption. And if you can calibrate your adsorption, then a lot of numerical models that you're using for multiple purposes, one of them that was particularly important to us was the cyclic gas injection models, and then can benefit from those calibrations. But this is something that an ongoing research right now for us as a continuation of this.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that ATCE paper. So I'll definitely read that in a few months.
Thank you. You yourself, I guess nobody interviewed you, but I would like to take this opportunity and tell everybody who's listening to this, probably because they're interested in choke management, for them to check out your paper on choke management from last year, and mostly black oil. That was a very good paper. I attended that talk, so thank you for that as well.
Oh, I appreciate it, really do. Well, folks, I want to thank Yalda Barzin for letting me pepper her with questions. And
my pleasure.
Of course, and I really enjoyed having you on the podcast.
Thank you. Really appreciate you providing this opportunity for me to share my learning with your viewers.
Of course. Well, folks, that's a wrap for Petra Papers, episode 2 for season 3. I'm Yoga Shri Pradhan, and we're signing off.